Sofia Navarro had calculated every possible variable in her plan to infiltrate the most exclusive gambling den in the city, except for the possibility that Dante Romano would take one look at her across the poker table and decide she was the only gamble worth taking, no matter the cost. The Velvet Room existed in the shadows between legitimate business and dangerous enterprise, accessible only to those with enough money to lose fortunes without flinching, and enough sense to never speak of what they witnessed within its opulent walls. Located 3 floors beneath Romano's flagship casino in downtown Chicago, it was where the city's most powerful men came to play games that could reshape empires or destroy lives with the turn of a single card. Dante Romano surveyed his domain from behind the one-way glass of his private office, watching the night's players settle into their seats around tables that had seen more money change hands than some country's entire GDP. At 31, he commanded an underground empire that stretched from the legitimate casino's bearing. His family named the invitation-only games that operated in the gray spaces between legal and lethal. He had inherited more than just a business from his grandfather. He had inherited a philosophy that treated human nature as a mathematical equation, emotions as weaknesses to be exploited, and trust as a luxury he could never afford. Dante Romano played every game to win, calculated every risk with surgical precision, and had never met a person whose motives he couldn't read like cards spread face up on felt, which was why the woman, who had just entered his most exclusive game, intrigued him in ways that felt both dangerous and irresistible. Sofia Navarro moved through the Velvet Room with the careful confidence of someone who belonged there, but Dante's trained eye caught the subtle tells that marked her as an outsider. Her black evening gown was expensive but not custom-tailored. Her jewelry was elegant, but not the kind that came from generational wealth. Most tellingly, her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who was studying the room rather than simply enjoying it. She was beautiful in a way that seemed designed to distract men from noticing how carefully she was observing everything around her. Auburn hair swept into an elegant updo that revealed the graceful line of her neck, green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and something that looked almost like determination, a smile that appeared genuine but never quite reached those calculating eyes. Dante had built his empire on his ability to read people, to identify their weaknesses and exploit their desires. But as he watched Sofia take her seat at the highest-stakes poker table, he found himself genuinely curious about what had brought a university mathematics professor into his world, because that's exactly what she was, according to the background check his security team had completed within minutes of her arrival. Dr. Sofia Navarro, Ph.D. in applied mathematics from MIT, currently teaching probability theory and statistical analysis at Northwestern University. No criminal record, no gambling debts, no obvious reason why she would risk the buy-in required for tonight's game, unless she wasn't here to gamble at all. The thought sent a thrill through Dante that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the challenge this woman represented. It had been years since anyone had attempted to infiltrate his operations, longer still since anyone had intrigued him enough to make him want to discover their true motives personally, rather than simply having them removed from the premises. Dante made his way down to the gaming floor, moving through the room with the quiet authority that made conversations pause and players straighten in their chairs. He was dressed in his usual black suit, perfectly tailored to his lean frame, with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of wealth so secure it didn't need to advertise itself. As he approached the poker table where Sofia sat shuffling chips with practiced ease, Dante found himself studying her with the intensity usually reserved for analyzing opponents who posed genuine threats to his business interests. "Ms. Navarro," he said, his voice carrying just enough to catch her attention without alerting the other players to his knowledge of her identity. Sofia looked up at him with those intelligent green eyes, and Dante felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the way she met his gaze without flinching, without the deference most people showed when they realized who he was. "Mr. Romano," she replied, her voice steady and professional, as if they were meeting at a university faculty gathering, rather than in an underground gambling den, where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card. "Welcome to the Velvet Room," Dante said, settling into the empty chair directly across from her at the table. "I trust you'll find tonight's game educational. Sophia's smile was sharp and beautiful, revealing nothing of her true intentions while promising that she was exactly the kind of opponent who could make the evening interesting. "I'm counting on it," she replied, and Dante realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was looking forward to a game where the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Dante had spent his life reading people like open books, but Sofia Navarro was written in a language he was suddenly desperate to learn. The game that followed was unlike anything Dante had experienced in 20 years of high-stakes gambling. Sofia played with a mathematical precision that bordered on artistry, calculating odds and reading patterns with the kind of analytical intelligence that transformed poker from a game of chance into a battle of minds. But more intriguing than her technical skill was the way she seemed completely immune to the psychological warfare that dominated these exclusive games, where other players revealed their emotions through unconscious gestures, nervous habits, or changes in breathing patterns. Sofia remained perfectly controlled, her expression revealing nothing beyond polite concentration. Dante found himself studying her with an intensity that went far beyond professional interest. The way she organized her chips in precise stacks suggested an orderly mind that valued control and preparation. The way she observed other players without seeming to stare indicated someone trained to gather information while remaining undetected. Most fascinating of all was the way she seemed to anticipate his own strategies, countering his moves with responses that suggested she understood not just the mathematics of the game, but the psychology of the man playing it. "Interesting approach to risk management," Dante commented during a brief break between hands, his voice pitched low enough that only Sofia could hear. "Mathematics doesn't lie," she replied, her fingers drumming a quiet rhythm against her chips. "People do, but numbers are always honest about probability and outcome. And yet you're here playing a game where human psychology matters as much as mathematical probability," Dante observed. Sofia's smile was enigmatic. "Perhaps I'm conducting research on the intersection of statistical analysis and human behavior under pressure." The answer was clever enough to be believable, and vague enough to reveal nothing, which only heightened Dante's certainty that Ms. Navarro was not what she appeared to be. University professors conducting academic research didn't typically risk $50,000 on a single game of poker, no matter how fascinating their scholarly interests. As the night progressed, Dante became increasingly convinced that Sofia was not just a skilled player, but a woman with a specific agenda that had brought her to his table. She won enough hands to establish herself as a serious competitor, but lost just enough to avoid drawing unwanted attention from other players. Her betting pattern suggested someone who understood the social dynamics of high-stakes gambling, as well as the mathematical principles underlying it. Most tellingly, she seemed to be studying the dealer, the cards, and the rhythm of the game with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was looking for something specific. Patterns, irregularities, or systems that might give certain players unfair advantages. The realization hit Dante like a perfectly played bluff. Sofia wasn't here to win money or enjoy the thrill of high-stakes gambling. She was here to expose something, to uncover some aspect of his operation that she believed was corrupt or illegal. The thought should have alarmed him. Anyone attempting to investigate his business represented a potential threat that needed to be neutralized quickly and completely. But instead of anger or concern, Dante felt something that might have been admiration, mixed with an excitement he hadn't experienced in years. Sofia Navarro was hunting him, and the realization made him want to be caught. When the game concluded near dawn, Sofia had won modestly, enough to cover her buy-in and expenses, but not enough to seem like she was there purely for profit. As other players settled their accounts and prepared to leave, Dante found himself reluctant to let the evening end. "Ms. Navarro," he said, as she gathered her winnings with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout the night. "I hope you found tonight's game illuminating." "Very much so," Sofia replied, meeting his gaze directly. "Though I suspect there's much more to learn about probability and risk in environments like this." "Perhaps you'd be interested in continuing your research," Dante said, his voice carrying undertones that had nothing to do with academic inquiry and everything to do with the challenge this woman represented. "I host similar games every Tuesday and Friday. I'd be happy to arrange for your invitation to become permanent. Sophia studied his face for a moment, her green eyes searching for motives he was careful not to reveal. "That's very generous, Mr. Romano. I accept." As Dante watched her leave the velvet room, moving with the same quiet confidence that had marked her entire evening, he realized that inviting her back was either the smartest or most dangerous decision he had made in years. But for the first time since inheriting his grandfather's empire, Dante Romano found himself looking forward to a gamble where he genuinely didn't know the outcome. Sophia had come to expose his secrets, but Dante was beginning to suspect that losing to her might be the first honest victory of his life. The investigation into Sofia Navarro's background began before she had even left the building. Dante's security team was thorough, efficient, and accustomed to uncovering secrets that people preferred to keep buried. Within 24 hours, he had a complete dossier on the woman who had walked into his world and somehow shifted the entire balance of power without firing a single shot. The facts painted a picture of someone driven by motivation far more personal than academic curiosity. Sofia Navarro had a younger brother, Miguel, who had been a promising graduate student in computer science until 6 months ago when he had lost everything. His savings, his scholarship, his apartment, and very nearly his life, in a single night of gambling at one of the Romano family's legitimate casinos. Miguel Navarro had been caught counting cards, a practice that was legal but unwelcome in establishments that depended on mathematical advantage to generate profit. What should have been a simple expulsion from the premises had escalated into something darker when Miguel had accused the casino of using sophisticated electronic systems to identify and eliminate skilled players, systems that crossed the line from legal business practices into technological manipulation that bordered on fraud. The accusations had been dismissed. Miguel had been blacklisted from every major casino in the city, and his life had spiraled into debt, depression, and desperation that had driven him to attempt suicide 3 months ago. He was alive but broken, staying in a rehabilitation facility that Sophia was paying for with money she didn't have, and loans that were slowly strangling her. Financially, Dante absorbed this information, with the analytical detachment that had served him well in business, but he found himself unexpectedly moved by the picture it painted. Sophia wasn't here for money, fame, or even justice in the abstract sense. She was here because someone she loved had been destroyed by his empire, and she was willing to risk everything to protect him and others like him. The realization should have made Dante more cautious about her presence in his operations. Instead, it made him respect her in ways that felt dangerous to both his business and his carefully guarded emotional defenses. But respect didn't prevent him from taking steps to ensure that Ms. Navarro's investigation proceeded exactly as he wanted it to proceed. The flowers began, arriving at her university office the next morning. A single white orchid delivered without explanation or identifying card. Sophia would find them puzzling but not alarming, beautiful but not overtly romantic, mysterious but not threatening. The coffee shop near her apartment suddenly began stocking her favorite pastries, items that had been special ordered by an anonymous customer who had noticed her preferences and wanted to ensure they were always available when she needed them. Her car, which had been developing engine problems that she couldn't afford to repair on a professor's salary, was serviced overnight by mechanics who left it running perfectly with a note, indicating that the repairs had been covered by a grateful former student who wished to remain anonymous. Each gesture was designed to be helpful rather than intrusive, generous rather than controlling, mysterious rather than obviously connected to their encounter at the poker table. Dante was courting her with the same strategic precision he brought to business negotiations, but with an investment of personal attention that surprised him with its intensity. More directly, he began ensuring that Sophia's continued access to the Velvet Room would provide her with exactly the kind of evidence she was looking for, but evidence that would lead her deeper into his world. Rather than providing her with grounds to expose it to outside authorities, the card-counting detection system that her brother had discovered was real, sophisticated, and completely illegal. But rather than simply denying its existence or preventing her from uncovering it, Dante arranged for Sophia to discover carefully curated information that would draw her closer to the truth while simultaneously drawing her closer to him. Anonymous sources began providing her with documentation about the electronic surveillance systems used in high-end gambling establishments. Industry insiders mysteriously became available for interviews about the intersection of technology and casino security. Academic conferences on probability and game theory suddenly featured presentations that seemed directly relevant to her unofficial research. Each piece of information was genuine, valuable, and pointed toward conclusions that were accurate, but incomplete. Sophia was being led toward discoveries that would satisfy her need for truth, while ensuring that any action she took based on those discoveries would require continued collaboration with the only person who could provide her with access to the evidence she needed. Dante was essentially conducting the most sophisticated seduction of his career, using truth instead of lies, evidence instead of manipulation, and genuine respect for her intelligence, instead of attempts to exploit her weaknesses. The strategy worked exactly as he had calculated it would. Sophia began spending more time researching casino security systems and less time focused on her university responsibilities. She started asking questions that indicated growing expertise in areas far beyond her academic specialty. Most tellingly, she began looking forward to their twice-weekly poker games with an anticipation that seemed to go beyond her original investigative purposes. Dante could see the exact moment when Sophia realized that her feelings about their encounters were becoming complicated by factors that had nothing to do with seeking justice for her brother. It happened during their fourth game together, when Dante made a betting decision that was mathematically sound but strategically unnecessary, choosing to lose a significant hand rather than force Sophia out of the game early. She studied his face across the table, her green eyes sharp with intelligence and growing suspicion. "That was an interesting choice," she commented, her voice carefully neutral. "Mathematics isn't the only factor in decision-making," Dante replied, meeting her gaze directly. "Sometimes the value of continuing to play exceeds the cost of any individual hand." Sophia's expression shifted as she processed the implications of his words, realizing that he was talking about more than poker strategy. The hunter was beginning to suspect she was being hunted in return, but she was no longer certain whether that terrified or thrilled her. The seduction intensified with each encounter, becoming a complex dance between truth and deception, investigation and attraction, professional necessity and personal desire. Sophia continued her research into the Romano family's gambling operations, but her focus was increasingly drawn to the enigmatic man who seemed to anticipate her every move while revealing nothing of his own motivations. Dante had never pursued a woman with such calculated intensity. Every conversation was strategically designed to reveal carefully selected aspects of his character while drawing out information about her thoughts, feelings, and plans. Every gesture was meant to demonstrate his power and resources while showing respect for her intelligence and independence. He arranged for her to discover evidence that would support her brother's accusations about electronic card-counting detection systems, but he presented it in ways that required her to continue working with him to gather additional proof. He provided her with access to industry experts and insider sources, but only through connections that emphasized his central role in her investigation. Most effectively, he began revealing glimpses of the man beneath the Casino King facade, showing her aspects of his personality that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the loneliness that came with never being able to trust anyone completely. "My grandfather built this empire by understanding that everyone has a price," Dante told her during a quiet moment between poker hands, his voice carrying undertones of something that might have been regret. "He taught me that emotional attachments were liabilities that competitors could exploit, that caring about people made you vulnerable in ways that could destroy everything you had worked to build." Sophia studied his face, seeing past the controlled expression to something that looked almost like longing. "And do you still believe that?" Dante's smile was enigmatic. "I'm beginning to think that some gambles might be worth taking, regardless of the mathematical probability of success." These conversations revealed layers of complexity that Sophia hadn't expected to find in a man whose reputation was built on cold calculation and ruthless efficiency. She began to see that Dante Romano was not just a successful criminal businessman, but someone who had sacrificed personal happiness for professional success, who had chosen isolation as the price of power and was only now beginning to question whether that choice had been worth making. The realization made her investigation feel increasingly complicated by factors that had nothing to do with seeking justice for her brother and everything to do with her growing fascination with the man who was simultaneously her opponent and her collaborator, but it was during their 6th game together that Sophia discovered just how thoroughly Dante had been manipulating the circumstances of their relationship. She had been tracking patterns in the electronic surveillance data she had gathered, using sophisticated statistical analysis to identify irregularities that suggested systematic cheating. The work was complex and time-consuming, requiring access to information that was closely guarded and difficult to obtain through legitimate channels, which was why she was so surprised to discover that someone had been providing her with exactly the data she needed, delivered through anonymous sources and insider contacts, who seemed remarkably well-informed about her research needs. The anonymous benefactor who had been facilitating her investigation was Dante himself. The realization hit her during a break in play when she noticed Dante checking his phone. At the exact moment she received a text message from one of her anonymous sources. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, the information too perfectly tailored to her needs to be anything other than deliberately orchestrated. "You've been helping me?" she said quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of accusation and something that might have been gratitude. Dante looked up from his phone, his expression revealing nothing beyond polite attention. "I'm not sure what you mean, Ms. Navarro. The sources, the documentation, the access to information that should be impossible for an outsider to obtain. You've been providing me with everything I needed to build a case against your own operations." Dante's smile was enigmatic. That would be a curious strategy for someone trying to protect illegal business practices. "Unless," Sophia continued, her analytical mind working through the implications, "you wanted me to discover the truth about your operations because the truth serves your interests better than secrecy." The insight was accurate and demonstrated exactly the kind of intelligence that had made Dante fall in love with her mind before. He had even begun to explore the possibility of winning her heart. "You're very perceptive, Ms. Navarro," Dante said quietly, "though I think you might be overestimating my influence over the information sources available to someone with your research skills." But Sophia was no longer focused on the specific mechanics of how he had been manipulating her investigation. She was beginning to understand that Dante Romano had been conducting an elaborate courtship disguised as a business negotiation, using her own quest for truth as a vehicle for drawing her deeper into his world and closer to his side. The realization should have made her angry. Instead, it made her pulse race with a combination of admiration for his strategic brilliance and excitement about what it meant for their evolving relationship. "What do you want from me?" she asked directly. Dante's gaze met hers across the poker table, his blue eyes holding depths of longing and determination that took her breath away. "Everything," he said simply. "I want your brilliant mind working with me instead of against me. I want your passion for justice channeled into making my operations more ethical rather than destroying them entirely. I want your company, your conversation, your presence in my life in ways that have nothing to do with business and everything to do with the fact that you're the first person I've met who makes me want to be better than I am." The confession was delivered with the same controlled intensity Dante brought to high-stakes negotiations, but Sophia could hear the genuine emotion beneath the strategic presentation. Sophia realized that Dante had been seducing her with truth instead of lies, and she was no longer sure whether that made him more trustworthy or more dangerous. The shift in their relationship became obvious to everyone who observed them together. Where once Sophia had watched Dante with the careful attention of someone gathering intelligence, now she looked at him with the complicated mixture of attraction and wariness that marked a woman falling in love despite her better judgment. Dante intensified his campaign with the precision of a general who sensed victory within reach. The anonymous gifts became more personal and frequent. First-edition books on probability theory that he somehow knew she had been wanting to read, tickets to lectures by mathematicians whose work she admired, access to academic resources that would normally require months of bureaucratic navigation to obtain. But more powerful than any material gesture was the way Dante began, including Sophia in aspects of his business that went far beyond their poker games. He invited her to observe the legitimate operations of his casinos, showing her the sophisticated security systems and mathematical principles that governed legal gambling enterprises. He introduced her to his senior staff members, presenting her as a consultant whose expertise in probability theory could help improve their operations. Most significantly, he began asking for her input on business decisions, treating her intelligence and analytical skills as resources that could benefit his empire rather than threats that needed to be contained. The new casino in Las Vegas is implementing updated card-counting detection protocols, Dante explained during one of their private meetings in his office above the Velvet Room. I'd value your assessment of whether the systems cross ethical boundaries that could expose us to legal challenges. Sophia studied the technical specifications he had provided, her mathematical training allowing her to understand both the sophistication of the technology and its implications for player privacy and fairness. It's brilliant, she admitted reluctantly, but it's also completely illegal in most jurisdictions. You're not just identifying skilled players, you're psychologically profiling them in ways that violate basic privacy rights. And if we were to redesign the systems to operate within legal parameters while still protecting the casino's interests, Dante asked. It would be possible, Sophia said slowly, but it would require significant modifications to the existing protocols and ongoing oversight to ensure compliance with privacy regulations. Dante's smile was satisfied, as if her response had confirmed something he had already suspected. Would you be interested in consulting on that redesign process? The offer was seductive in ways that went far beyond the generous financial compensation he was implying. Sophia would have the opportunity to use her expertise to make gambling operations more ethical while being paid exceptionally well for work that aligned with her academic interests and personal values. But more than that, accepting would mean ongoing collaboration with Dante, regular meetings and conversations that would inevitably deepen their personal connection while giving her continued access to the information she needed to help her brother's recovery and prevent similar situations from affecting other vulnerable gamblers. I'd need complete access to your current systems, Sophia said, testing the boundaries of what he was willing to offer, granted, and authority to recommend. Modifications that prioritize player protection over profit, maximization, agreed, and assurance that the findings of my analysis won't be suppressed if they reveal practices that need to be discontinued. Dante's expression grew serious, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. Ms. Navarro, if you agree to work with me, you'll have my complete trust and support, even when your recommendations challenge practices that have been profitable for my operations. The promise was delivered with such conviction that Sophia found herself believing him despite everything she knew about his reputation and business practices. But it was that evening, as she sat in her apartment reviewing the consulting contract Dante's lawyers had prepared, that Sophia realized just how completely she had been outmaneuvered by a master strategist. The contract was extraordinarily generous in terms of compensation, authority, and access to information. But embedded within the legal language were clauses that would effectively make her a permanent part of Dante's organization, with responsibilities and privileges that would tie her to his operations for years to come. She would become his partner in reforming his empire, rather than his opponent trying to destroy it. She would use her skills to make his operations more ethical, rather than exposing their current violations to law enforcement. She would be working with him to build something better, rather than against him to tear down something corrupt. Most significantly, she would be spending considerable time in close collaboration with a man who had demonstrated his ability to anticipate her thoughts, respond to her needs, and make her feel intellectually and emotionally engaged in ways that no one else in her life ever had. Dante Romano had essentially maneuvered her into a position where pursuing justice for her brother required falling deeper under his influence, where using her expertise to help vulnerable gamblers required working closely with the most dangerous man she had ever met. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it made her pulse race with anticipation for challenges that would test every aspect of her intelligence, integrity, and emotional resilience. Sophia signed the contract at midnight, knowing that she was making a decision that would change the course of her life in ways she couldn't predict or control. She had walked into his trap willingly, but Sophia was beginning to suspect that Dante had trapped himself just as completely as he had captured her. The transition from opponent to partner proved more complicated than either Sophia or Dante had anticipated. Working together required a level of trust and communication that neither of them was accustomed to, particularly when their collaboration involved reforming operations that had been built on secrecy and psychological manipulation. Sophia threw herself into analyzing the Romano family's gambling systems with the thoroughness that had made her reputation in academic circles. She discovered layers of technological sophistication and mathematical precision that impressed her even as they revealed the extent to which players were being systematically disadvantaged by methods that crossed legal and ethical boundaries. But more disturbing than the technical violations were the human costs she uncovered as she dug deeper into the impact of these systems on individual players, men and women who had lost everything because sophisticated profiling had identified their psychological weaknesses and targeted them with personalized manipulation designed to maximize their losses. People like her brother, whose mathematical skills had made him a threat to be eliminated rather than a customer to be served. "This is worse than I thought," Sophia told Dante during one of their weekly progress meetings, spreading financial records and psychological profiles across his office desk. "You're not just running gambling operations, you're conducting psychological warfare against people who are already vulnerable to addiction and financial desperation." Dante studied the evidence she had compiled, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts or feelings about what her research had uncovered. "What do you recommend?" he asked quietly. "Complete overhaul of your player identification and targeting systems," Sophia replied without hesitation. "Implementation of responsible gambling protocols that prioritize player welfare over profit maximization. An immediate cessation of psychological profiling techniques that exploit mental health vulnerabilities." The recommendations would cost Dante's organization millions in lost revenue and require fundamental changes to business practices that had been generating extraordinary profits for decades. The financial impact would be significant, Dante observed. "The ethical impact of continuing current practices is more significant," Sophia countered. "You asked me to help you build operations that could survive legal scrutiny and public exposure. These changes aren't optional if you want to achieve those goals." Dante was quiet for a long moment, his analytical mind clearly working through the implications of her recommendations and the costs of implementing them. "Proceed with your proposed modifications," he said finally. "You have my complete authorization to restructure whatever systems you believe need to be changed." Sophia stared at him, surprised by his willingness to accept recommendations that would fundamentally alter the basis of his empire's profitability. "This will change everything about how your operations function," she warned. "Your profit margins, your competitive advantages, your ability to guarantee returns to investors. All of that will be affected by prioritizing player welfare over maximum revenue extraction." Dante's smile was enigmatic. "Perhaps it's time my operations reflected values beyond purely financial success." The work that followed was the most challenging and rewarding of Sophia's career. She essentially functioned as Dante's partner in reimagining how gambling enterprises could operate ethically while remaining profitable, using her mathematical expertise to design systems that protected vulnerable players, while still generating sustainable revenue. But more intoxicating than the professional satisfaction was the growing intimacy of her relationship with Dante himself. Their collaboration required daily meetings, lengthy discussions about complex problems, and the kind of intellectual partnership that revealed aspects of both their personalities that neither had shared with anyone else. Sophia discovered that beneath his reputation for cold calculation, Dante possessed a genuine concern for the people affected by his business decisions. He had inherited an empire built on exploitation, but he was willing to sacrifice profitability to transform it into something that aligned with principles he had never been taught to value. Dante, in turn, was fascinated by Sophia's ability to balance analytical rigor with emotional intelligence, her capacity to design systems that were both mathematically sound and ethically principled. Their working relationship gradually evolved into something that felt increasingly personal, characterized by long conversations that ranged far beyond business concerns and moments of connection, that had nothing to do with gambling systems or profit margins. But it was the night when everything went wrong that Dante realized just how completely Sophia had become the center of his world. The attack came without warning, during one of their evening meetings in Dante's private office. Rival families had been watching the changes in Romano operations with growing concern, recognizing that ethical gambling practices represented a threat to industry standards that benefited everyone who prioritized profit over player welfare. If Dante succeeded in proving that casinos could be profitable while treating customers fairly, other operations would face pressure to implement similar reforms or risk being exposed as deliberately exploitative. The solution, from their perspective, was to eliminate the source of these troublesome ethical innovations. Sophia was reviewing financial projections when the first gunshot shattered the office windows. Dante's reaction was instantaneous and protective. He shoved her behind his desk while simultaneously activating security protocols that would summon armed response teams and lock down the building. But the attackers had planned their assault carefully, anticipating security measures and positioning themselves to maximize damage while minimizing their own exposure. When the shooting stopped, Sophia was unconscious and bleeding from a head wound that would require emergency surgery, and Dante Romano was experiencing terror for the first time in his adult life. Dante had built his empire on the principle that everyone was expendable, but as he watched Sophia's blood stain his office carpet, he realized that some things were worth any price to protect. The hospital waiting room became Dante's world for 72 hours, while Sophia fought for her life in intensive care. He sat in sterile chairs, drank terrible coffee, and experienced emotions that he had spent years training himself not to feel. Fear consumed him in ways that had nothing to do with business concerns or professional consequences. This was personal terror, the kind that came from realizing that someone else's life had become more important than his own survival, more valuable than his empire, more precious than anything he had ever possessed or achieved. Dante's security team worked around the clock to identify and neutralize the people responsible for the attack, but their efficiency in handling the business aspects of the crisis only highlighted how completely unprepared he was for the emotional devastation of potentially losing Sophia. When she finally regained consciousness on the fourth day, her first words were characteristically analytical. "How bad is the damage to your office?" she asked, her voice weak but concerned about practical matters rather than her own condition. "The office can be repaired," Dante replied, his voice rough with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to express in front of anyone else. "What matters is that you're alive." Sophia studied his face, seeing past his controlled expression to the fear and relief that he was trying to hide. "You look like hell," she observed. "I've been here since they brought you in," Dante admitted. I needed to know that you were going to be okay." The confession revealed more than he had intended, but Sophia's brush with death had stripped away his usual caution about emotional vulnerability. "Who did this?" Sophia asked. "Competitors who were concerned about the changes we've been implementing," Dante replied grimly. "They saw our reforms as a threat to industry practices that benefit everyone who prioritizes profit over ethics. They tried to kill me to stop gambling reform." Sophia's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and anger. "They tried to kill you to get to me," Dante corrected, his voice hardening with fury that had been building for days. "They knew that hurting you was the most effective way to destroy my focus and compromise my decision-making capabilities." Sophia absorbed this information, understanding the implications for both her safety and their continued collaboration. "What happens now?" she asked. Dante was quiet for a moment, his internal struggle visible in his expression, as he weighed business considerations against personal feelings that had become too powerful to ignore. "Now, I make sure that anyone who threatens you understands the consequences of that decision," he said finally, his voice carrying undertones of lethal determination. But it was later that evening, when Sophia was resting and Dante thought she was asleep, that she heard him make the phone call that revealed the full extent of his feelings. "Listen carefully," Dante said to someone on the other end of the line, his voice carrying the cold authority that had built his empire. "Anyone who touches her answers to me personally. Anyone who threatens her will discover why the Romano family has survived when others have not. Anyone who thinks that hurting Ms. Navarro is an acceptable strategy for influencing my business decisions has made the last mistake of their lives." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Dante issuing instructions that made clear he was willing to use every resource at his disposal to protect Sophia from further threats. When he finished the call and turned back toward her hospital bed, he discovered that Sophia was awake and had heard every word. "That was quite a declaration," she said quietly. Dante's expression shifted as he realized how much she had overheard, revealing the emotional vulnerability he had been trying to hide. "You weren't supposed to hear that," he said. "But I'm glad I did," Sophia replied. "Because I need to understand what I mean to you before I can decide what you mean to me." Dante moved closer to her bedside, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty about how to express feelings that he had never allowed himself to fully acknowledge. "I've spent my life calculating odds and managing risks," he said finally, his voice carrying depths of emotion that took Sophia's breath away. "I've built an empire on the principle that emotional attachments are liabilities that can be exploited by enemies and competitors. But you're the only sure thing I've ever wanted to bet everything on." Sophia felt her heart race at the intensity in his voice, the way he spoke as if she were the answer to questions he had been asking his entire life. "Dante," she began, but he continued as if he needed to say everything before he lost his courage. "You walked into my world to expose my crimes, and instead showed me how to become someone worthy of your respect. You challenged my operations and made me want to build something that would make you proud, rather than something that would simply generate profit. You turned an investigation into a collaboration, and somehow made me fall in love with the idea of being better than I am." Dante sat down in the chair beside her hospital bed, his blue eyes holding hers with desperate honesty. "I love your brilliant mind that can solve problems I didn't even know existed. I love your fierce integrity that refuses to compromise on principles, even when compromise would be easier. I love the way you make me want to be worthy of you, the way you see possibilities for redemption in situations where I only saw systems to be exploited." Sophia stared at him, overwhelmed by the raw emotion in his confession, and the realization that this powerful, dangerous man was laying his heart completely bare. "You love me?" she said quietly, as if testing the words. "Completely, irrevocably, in ways that terrify me because they make me vulnerable to consequences I can't control or predict," Dante replied without hesitation. "You're the first person I've ever met who makes me want to risk everything for the possibility of something real." Sophia reached out to touch his hand, her fingers intertwining with his as she processed the magnitude of what he had just revealed. "What if I can't give you what you need?" she asked. "What if I'm not strong enough for the life you live, the dangers that come with your world?" Dante's grip on her hand tightened, his voice fierce with protective determination. "Then I'll change my world until it's safe enough for you to be in it. I'll transform my operations until they align with your values. I'll become whatever I need to be to deserve you and keep you safe." Sophia felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized the full extent of what Dante was offering. Not just his love, but his willingness to reshape his entire life around her needs and values. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling like both a confession and a promise. "I love you despite knowing it's dangerous, despite knowing it complicates everything I thought I wanted from my life. I love how you make me feel like the smartest, strongest, most capable version of myself." They had declared their love in a hospital room surrounded by the consequences of his dangerous world, but Sophia was about to discover that loving Dante Romano meant facing threats that could destroy them both. Sophia's recovery became a siege as Dante transformed her hospital room into a fortress guarded by his most trusted security personnel. The attack had made clear that their relationship was not just a personal matter but a strategic vulnerability that rivals could exploit to destabilize his entire operation. But, rather than retreat from their collaboration, or distance himself to protect her from future threats, Dante doubled down on his commitment to both their professional partnership and their personal relationship. If enemies wanted to use Sophia as a weapon against him, he would make sure that protecting her became his greatest strength rather than his weakness. The security arrangements were comprehensive and intrusive in ways that would have been overwhelming for most people. Trained bodyguards accompanied Sophia everywhere. Her apartment was transformed into a secure facility with surveillance systems and reinforced defenses. and every aspect of her daily routine was analyzed for potential risks and adjusted to minimize exposure to threats. But Dante's approach to her protection was unlike anything Sophia had experienced with previous security arrangements. Instead of treating her like a valuable asset to be locked away from danger, he worked with her to develop safety protocols that allowed her to continue her work, maintain her independence, and live her life according to her own values and priorities. "I won't be a prisoner in my own life," Sophia told him during one of their evening meetings in her newly fortified apartment. "If loving you means giving up everything that makes me who I am, then what's the point of being together?" "The point," Dante replied, "is finding ways to be together that enhance who we are rather than limiting who we can become. Your safety is non-negotiable, but your freedom and autonomy are equally important to me." The balance proved challenging to achieve, requiring constant adjustments as they navigated the intersection of personal desires and professional necessities. Sophia continued her work reforming Dante's gambling operations, but now every meeting included security assessments and threat evaluations. She maintained her university teaching responsibilities, but her classroom was monitored by personnel trained to identify and neutralize potential dangers. Most significantly, their relationship deepened with the intensity that came from facing genuine threats together. Shared danger had a way of stripping away pretense and revealing what truly mattered, forcing both of them to confront feelings that might have taken years to develop under ordinary circumstances. "I've never been in love before," Dante admitted during a quiet evening when they were reviewing security reports and business projections in the study of Sophia's apartment. "I don't know how to balance protecting you with respecting your independence." "You've never been in love?" Sophia asked, surprised by this revelation about a man whose romantic reputation preceded him everywhere he went. "I've been attracted to women, enjoyed their company, even cared about their welfare," Dante replied. "But I've never met anyone whose happiness was more important to me than my own success, whose safety I would prioritize above my business interests." Sophia set aside the financial report she had been reviewing, giving him her complete attention. "What's different about me?" Dante was quiet for a moment, considering how to articulate feelings that went beyond his usual analytical framework. "You're the first person who ever challenged me to become better, rather than simply accepting me as I am," he said finally. "You saw potential for redemption in operations I had written off as necessarily corrupt. You believed I could be worthy of your respect before I believed it myself." The vulnerability in his voice made Sophia's chest tight with emotion. This was not the calculating casino king who had built an empire on reading human weakness, but a man who had discovered that love could be transformative rather than limiting. "I love you for who you are," Sophia said softly. "But I also love who you're becoming. Watching you choose ethics over easy profit, watching you prioritize player welfare over maximum revenue, that shows me a man whose heart is more impressive than his empire." Their evening was interrupted by the arrival of Dante's head of security with news that would test every aspect of their commitment to each other and their shared vision for transforming his operations. "We've identified the families responsible for the attack," Marcus reported grimly. "But eliminating the immediate threat is going to require responses that could escalate the situation beyond what we can handle through conventional security measures." Dante's expression hardened as he processed the implications. "Recommendations? Full-scale war," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Complete elimination of the opposing organizations before they can mount additional attacks. It's the only way to ensure Ms. Navarro's long-term safety." Sophia felt her blood run cold as she realized what was being discussed. Dante was being advised to commit multiple murders to protect her from future threats. "No," she said immediately. "Absolutely not. I won't be responsible for people dying because of our relationship." "You won't be responsible," Dante corrected. "I will be, and I'll accept that responsibility gladly if it keeps you safe." "That's not who I want you to be," Sophia said desperately. "That's not the man I fell in love with. The Dante Romano I love is someone who chooses difficult ethical paths over easy violent solutions." Dante stared at her, his internal conflict visible as he weighed his desire to protect her against her plea for him to remain the man she had helped him become. "Then what do you suggest?" he asked quietly. "Because doing nothing means accepting that you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. that our relationship will always be shadowed by threats from people who want to destroy what we're building together. Sophia took a deep breath, her analytical mind working through possibilities that could address the immediate danger while preserving the principles that had brought them together. "We expose everything," she said. "We release all the evidence I've gathered about industry practices, make our reforms public, and use transparency as protection. If our work becomes public knowledge, killing us becomes counterproductive, rather than strategically advantageous." The suggestion was brilliant, dangerous, and completely aligned with the values that had guided their collaboration from the beginning. Sophia had just proposed the most dangerous gamble of their lives, betting their safety on the power of truth in a world built on secrets and lies. The decision to go public with their investigation required careful orchestration that would maximize impact while minimizing opportunities for their enemies to eliminate them before the information could be released. Sophia and Dante worked together to prepare a comprehensive expose that would reveal not just the Romano family's previous violations, but the industry-wide practices that had made such violations profitable and common. The documentation was extensive and damning, revealing the sophisticated technological and psychological systems that major gambling operations use to identify and exploit vulnerable players. But more importantly, it would also showcase the reforms that Dante had implemented, demonstrating that profitable gambling enterprises could operate ethically when leadership prioritized player welfare over maximum revenue extraction. "This will destroy the current industry model," Sophia observed as they finalized the materials that would be simultaneously released to major news outlets, regulatory agencies, and law enforcement organizations. "Every major casino will face pressure to implement similar reforms or risk public exposure as deliberately exploitative." "Good," Dante replied grimly. "An industry built on deliberately harming vulnerable people deserves to be destroyed and rebuilt according to better principles." The comment revealed how completely Dante had been transformed by their collaboration. The man who had inherited an empire built on exploitation had become someone willing to sacrifice that empire to protect the people it had been designed to harm. But it was the personal cost of their decision that weighed most heavily on both of them. Going public would make Dante's operations subject to unprecedented scrutiny, potentially resulting in criminal charges that could send him to prison for years. More immediately, it would paint targets on both of them that might prove impossible to remove, even after their enemies had been neutralized. "I need you to understand what you're risking," Dante told Sophia the night before they planned to release their information. "This isn't just about gambling reform or business ethics. This is about choosing a life where we'll always be looking over our shoulders, where our relationship will always be complicated by consequences we can't predict or control." Sophia looked at the man who had become the center of her world, seeing not just the casino king who had built an empire on calculated risks, but the person who had learned to value love above power, ethics above profit, and her happiness above his own survival. "I've spent my entire adult life calculating probabilities and analyzing risk factors," she replied. "But you taught me that some decisions have to be made with the heart, rather than the head, that some gambles are worth taking regardless of the mathematical odds of success." Dante moved closer to her, his blue eyes holding depths of love and determination that took her breath away. "Ms. Navarro," he said, his voice carrying the intensity that had first captured her attention across a poker table months earlier, "you walked into my world to expose my secrets, and instead gave me reasons to become worthy of your love. You challenged my operations and made me want to build something that would make you proud, rather than something that would simply generate profit." Sophia felt her heart race as Dante continued, his words carrying the weight of a man laying his entire future at her feet. "I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life. I love your brilliant mind that sees solutions where I only see problems. I love your fierce integrity that refuses to compromise on principles even when compromise would be safer. I love the way you make me want to be better than I ever thought possible." Dante took her hands in his voice breaking slightly with the intensity of his emotion. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because it's safe or logical or mathematically sound, but because I can't imagine a future that doesn't have you at the center of it. Because I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of the trust you've placed in me." Sophia stared at him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering, and the courage it took to propose marriage on the eve of decisions that could destroy both their lives. "Yes," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Yes, absolutely yes. I love you, Dante Romano. And I want to build something beautiful and complicated and extraordinary with you." The proposal was sealed not with physical gestures, but with promises that carried the weight of two people, choosing love over safety, truth over comfort, and each other over every other consideration that had previously guided their lives. The next morning, their comprehensive exposé was simultaneously released to news outlets across the country, regulatory agencies in multiple jurisdictions, and law enforcement organizations with authority to investigate and prosecute gambling crimes. The impact was immediate and devastating to the existing industry model. Within hours, major casinos were scrambling to implement reforms, regulatory agencies were launching investigations, and competitors who had threatened Sophia and Dante found themselves facing criminal charges that made revenge attacks counterproductive and legally dangerous. But more importantly, the Romano family's proactive cooperation with authorities and their demonstrated commitment to ethical operations positioned them as industry leaders rather than targets for prosecution. "We did it," Sophia said as they watched news coverage of the story that was reshaping an entire industry. "We actually did it. We're just getting started," Dante replied, pulling her close against his side. "Reforming the gambling industry was just our engagement project. Wait until you see what we can accomplish as husband and wife." Sophia laughed, feeling joy bubble up from a place deeper than professional satisfaction or personal vindication. This was the happiness that came from finding someone who enhanced, rather than limited, who she could become. Someone who made her brave enough to bet everything on love. They had started as opponents across a poker table and become partners in rebuilding an empire, proving that sometimes the biggest gamble of all was learning to trust someone with your heart.